The Bryce Commission's report on the destruction of Dinant is an example of the testimony laid before them. It follows a clear statement of the outrages at Dinant, which many travelers will recall as a singularly picturesque town on the Meuse, is given by one witness, who says that the Germans began burning houses in the Rue St. Jacques on the 21st of August, and that every house in the street was burned. On the following day, an engagement took place between the French and the Germans, and the witness spent the whole day in the cellar of a bank with his wife and children. On the morning of the 23rd, about 5 o'clock, firing ceased, and almost immediately afterward a party of Germans came to the house. They rang the bell and began to batter at the door and windows. The witness's wife went to the door, and 2 or 3 Germans came in. The family were ordered out into the street. There they found another family, and the 2 families were driven with their hands above their heads along the Rue Grande. All the houses in the street were burning. The party was eventually put into a forge where there were a number of other prisoners, about 100 in all, and were kept there from 11 a.m. till 2 p.m. They were then taken to the prison. There they were assembled in a courtyard and searched. No arms were found. They were then passed through into the prison itself and put into cells. The witness and his wife were separated from each other. During the next hour, the witness heard rifle shots continually and noticed in the corner of a courtyard leading off the row of cells the body of a young man with a mantle thrown over it. He recognized the mantle as having belonged to his wife. The witness's daughter was allowed to go out to see what had happened to her mother, and the witness himself was allowed to go across the courtyard half an hour afterward for the same purpose. She had bullet wounds in 4 places, but was alive, and told her husband to return to the children, and he did so. About 5 o'clock in the evening he saw the Germans bringing out all the young and middle-aged men from the cells, and arranging their prisoners, to the number of 40, in 3 rows in the middle of the courtyard. About 20 Germans were drawn up opposite, but before anything was done there was a tremendous fusillade from some point near the prison, and the civilians were hurried back to their cells. Half an hour later, the same 40 men were brought back into the courtyard. Almost immediately there was a second fusillade, and they were driven back to the cells again. About 7 o'clock, the witness and other prisoners were brought out of their cells and marched out of the prison. They went between 2 lines of troops to the Roche-Bayard, about a kilometer away. An hour later, the women and children were separated, and the prisoners were brought back to Dinant, passing the prison on their way. Just outside the prison, the witness saw 3 lines of bodies, which he recognized as being those of his neighbors. They were nearly all dead, but he noticed movement in some of them. There were about 120 bodies. The prisoners were then taken up to a hill outside of Dinant and compelled to stay there till 8 o'clock in the morning. On the following day they were put into cattle trucks and taken thence to Koblenz. For 3 months they remained prisoners in Germany. Unarmed civilians were killed in masses at other places near the prison. About 90 bodies were seen lying on top of one another in a grass square opposite the convent. A witness asked a German officer why her husband had been shot, and he told her that it was because 2 of her sons had been in the civil guard and had shot at the Germans. As a matter of fact, one of her sons was at that time in Liège and the other in Brussels. It is stated that besides the 90 corpses referred to above, 60 corpses of civilians were recovered from a hole in the brewery yard, and that 48 bodies of women and children were found in a garden. The town was systematically set on fire by hand grenades. Another witness saw a little girl of 7, one of whose legs were broken, and the other injured by a bayonet. We have no reason to believe that the civilian population of Dinant gave any provocation, or that any other defense can be put forward to justify the treatment inflicted upon its citizens. The Bryce Commission reports the outrages in a number of Belgian villages in this terse fashion. In Hofstad, a number of houses had been set on fire, and many corpses were seen, some in houses, some in backyards, and some in the streets. 2 witnesses speak of having seen the body of a young man pierced by bayonet thrusts with the wrists cut also. On a side road, the corpse of a civilian was seen on his doorstep with a bayonet wound in his stomach, and by his side the dead body of a boy, 5 or 6, with his hands nearly severed. The corpses of a woman and boy were found at the blacksmith. They had been killed with a bayonet. In a cafe, a young man, also killed with the bayonet, was holding his hands together as if in the attitude of supplication. In the garden of a house in the main street, bodies of 2 women were observed, and in another house the body of a boy of 16 with 2 bayonet wounds in the chest. In Semst, a similar condition of affairs existed. Houses were burning, and in some of them were the charred remains of civilians. In a bicycle shop, a witness saw the burned corpse of a man. Other witnesses speak of this incident. Another civilian, unarmed, was shot as he was running away. As will be remembered, all the arms were given up some time before by order of the Burgermeister. At Weerde, 4 corpses of civilians were lying in the road. It was said that these men had fired upon the German soldiers, but this is denied. The arms had been given up long before. 2 children were killed in the village of Weerde, quite wantonly, as they were standing in the road with their mother. They were 3 or 4 years old and were killed with the bayonet. A small barn burning close by formed a convenient means of getting rid of bodies. They were thrown into the flames from the bayonets. It is right to add that no commissioned officer was present at the time. At Eppenheim, on August 25th, a pregnant woman who had been wounded with a bayonet was discovered in the convent. She was dying. On the road, 6 dead bodies of laborers were seen. At Bottmerbeke, a German soldier was seen to fire 3 times at a little girl, 5 years old. Having failed to hit her, he subsequently bayoneted her. He was killed with the butt end of a rifle by a Belgian soldier who had seen him commit this murder from a distance. At Herent, the charred body of a civilian was found in a butcher's shop, and in a handcart 20 yards away was the dead body of a laborer. 2 eyewitnesses relate that a German soldier shot a civilian and stabbed him with the bayonet as he lay. He then made one of these witnesses, a civilian prisoner, smell the blood on the bayonet. At Hecht, the bodies of 10 civilians were seen lying in a row by a brewery wall. In a laborer's house, which had been broken up, the mutilated corpse of a woman of 30 to 35 was discovered. Concerning the treatment of women and children in general, the report continues. The evidence shows that the German authorities, when carrying out a policy of systematic arson and plunder in selected districts, usually drew some distinction between the adult male population on the one hand and the women and children on the other. It was the frequent practice to set apart the adult males of the condemned district with a view to the execution of a suitable number, preferably of the younger and more vigorous, and to reserve the women and children for milder treatment. The depositions, however, present many instances of calculated cruelty, often going to the length of murder, toward the women and children of the condemned area. At Dinant, 60 women and children were confined in the cellar of a convent from Sunday morning till the following Friday, August 28th, sleeping on the ground, for there were no beds, and with nothing to drink during the whole period, and given no food until Wednesday, when someone threw into the cellar 2 sticks of macaroni and a carrot for each prisoner. In other cases, the women and children were marched for long distances along roads, as for instance the march of the women from Louvain to Terlemont. On August 28th, the laggards pricked on by the attendant Uhlans. A lady complains of having been brutally kicked by privates. Others were struck at with the butt end of rifles. At Louvain, at Liège, at Aerschot, at Malines, at Montigny, at Aden, and elsewhere, there is evidence that the troops were not restrained from drunkenness, and drunken soldiers cannot be trusted to observe the rules or decencies of war, least of all when they are called upon to execute a preordained plan of arson and pillage. From the very first, women were not safe. At Liège, women and children were chased about the streets by soldiers. Witnesses recount how a great crowd of men, women, and children from Aerschot were marched to Louvain and then suddenly exposed to a fire from a militrice and rifles. We were all placed, recounts a sufferer, in Station Street, Louvain, and the German soldiers fired on us. I saw the corpses of some women in the street. I fell down, and a woman who had been shot fell on top of me. Women and children suddenly turned out into the streets and, compelled to witness the destruction of their homes by fire, provided a sad spectacle, as were sober enough to see. A humane German officer witnessing the ruin of Aerschot exclaimed in disgust, "I am a father myself, and I cannot bear this. It is not war, but butchery." Officers as well as men succumbed to the temptation of drink, with results which may be illustrated by an incident which occurred at Kampenhout. In this village there was a certain well-to-do merchant, name given, who had a cellar of good champagne. On the afternoon of the 14th or 15th of August, 3 German cavalry officers entered the house and demanded champagne. Having drunk 10 bottles and invited 5 or 6 officers and 3 or 4 private soldiers to join them, they continued their carouse and then called for the master and mistress of the house. Immediately my mistress came in, says the valet de chambre. One of the officers who was sitting on the floor got up and, putting a revolver to my mistress's temple, shot her dead. The officer was obviously drunk. The other officers continued to drink and sing, and they did not pay any great attention to the killing of my mistress. The officer who shot my mistress then told my master to dig a grave and bury my mistress. My master and the officer went into the garden, the officer threatening my master with a pistol. My master was then forced to dig a grave and bury my mistress in it. I cannot say for what reason they killed my mistress. The officer who did it was singing all the time. In the evidence before us, there are cases tending to show that aggravated crimes against women were sometimes severely punished. One witness reports that a young girl who was being pursued by a drunken soldier at Louvain appealed to a German officer and that the offender was then and there shot. Another describes how an officer of the 32nd Regiment of the Line was led out to execution for the violation of two young girls, but reprieved at the request or with the consent of the girl's mother. These instances are sufficient to show that the maltreatment of women was no part of the military scheme of the invaders. However, much it may appear to have been the inevitable result of the system of terror deliberately adopted in certain regions. Indeed, so much is avowed. I asked the commander why we had been spared, said a lady in Louvain, who deposes to having suffered much brutal treatment during the sack. He said, "We will not hurt you any more. Stay in Louvain. All is finished." It was Saturday, August 29th, and the reign of terror was over. The Germans used men, women, and children of Belgium as screens for advancing infantry, as is shown in the following. Outside Fort Fleuron near Liège, men and children were marched in front of the Germans to prevent the Belgian soldiers from firing. The progress of the Germans through Mons was marked by many incidents of this character. Thus, on August 22nd, half a dozen Belgian colliers returning from work were marching in front of some German troops who were pursuing the English, and in the opinion of the witnesses, they must have been placed there intentionally. An English officer describes how he caused a barricade to be erected in a main thoroughfare leading out of the Mons, when the Germans, in order to reach a crossroad in the rear, fetched civilians out of the house on each side of the main road and compelled them to hold up white flags and act as a cover. Another British officer who saw this incident is convinced that the Germans were acting deliberately for the purpose of protecting themselves from the fire of British troops. Apart from this protection, the Germans could not have advanced, as the street was straight and commanded by the British rifle fire at a range of 700 or 800 yards. Several British soldiers also speak of this incident, and their story is confirmed by a Flemish witness in a side street. The French government also appointed a commission, headed by M. Georges Payet. This body made an investigation of the outrages committed by German officers and soldiers in northern France. Its report showed conditions that outstripped in horror the war tactics of savages. It makes the following accusation. In Rabai, 2 English cavalrymen who were surprised and wounded in this commune were finished off with gunshots by the Germans when they were dismounted and when one of them had thrown up his hands, showing thus that he was unarmed. In the department of the Marne, as everywhere, the German troops gave themselves up to general pillage, which was carried out always under similar conditions and with the complicity of their leaders. The communes of Heitz de Merupt, Suip, Marfac, Frontmentiers, and Esternay suffered especially in this way. Everything which the invader could carry off from the houses was placed on mortar lorries and vehicles. At Sheep, in particular, they carried off in this way a quantity of different objects, among these sewing machines and toys. A great many villages, as well as important country towns, were burned without any reason whatever. Without doubt, these crimes were committed by order as German detachments arrived in the neighborhood with their torches, their grenades, and their usual outfit for arson. At Merfaux, 19 private houses were burned. Of the commune of Glen, practically nothing remains. At Saint-Torbe, the entire village has been destroyed with the exception of the Mairie, the church, and 2 private buildings. At Havre, nearly the whole town has been destroyed. At Étrepi, 63 out of 70 families are homeless. At Huron, all of the houses with the exception of 5 have been burned. At Sermail-les-Bains, only about 40 houses out of 900 remain. At Bignicourt-sur-Saulx, 30 houses out of 33 are in ruin. At Chipé, the big market town which has been practically burned out, German soldiers carrying straw and cans of petrol have been seen in the streets. While the mayor's house was burning, 6 sentinels with fixed bayonets were under orders to forbid anyone to approach and to prevent any help being given. All this destruction by arson, which only represents a small proportion of the acts of the same kind in the department of Seine-et-Marne, was accomplished without the least tendency to rebellion or the smallest act of resistance being recorded against the inhabitants of the localities which are today more or less completely destroyed. In some villages, the Germans, before setting fire to them, made one of their soldiers fire a shot from his rifle so as to be able to pretend afterward that the civilian population had attacked them, an allegation which is all the more absurd since at the time when the enemy arrived, the only inhabitants left were old men, sick persons, or people absolutely without any means of aggression. Numerous crimes against the person have also been committed. In the majority of the communes, hostages have been taken away. Many of them have not returned. At Surmaise-les-Bains, the Germans carried off about 150 people, some of whom were decked out with helmets and coats and compelled, thus equipped, to mount guard over the bridges. At Bignacourt-sur-Salz, 30 men and 45 women and children were obliged to leave with the detachment. One of the men, a certain Émile Pierre, has not returned nor sent any news of himself. At Ch.6, M. Jacquet, who was carried off on the 7th of September with 11 of his fellow citizens, was found 500 meters from the village with a bullet in his head. At Champuy, his maidservant, and 4 other inhabitants who were taken away on the same day as the hostages of Ch.6 had not returned at the time of our visit to the place. At the same place, an old man named Jacquemin was tied down in his bed by an officer and left in this state without food for 3 days. He died a little time after. At Vert-la-Gravelle, a farmhand was killed. He was struck on the head with the bottle, and his chest was run through with the lance. The guard, Champriteur Bruffeller of Jaude-les-Forêts, was murdered at Maclonay, where he had been taken by the Germans. His body was found with his head shattered and a wound on his chest. At Champ-Guyon, a commune which has been fired, a certain Verdier was killed in his father-in-law's house. The latter was not present at the execution, but he heard a shot, and the next day an officer said to him, "Son shot. He is under the ruins." In spite of the search made, the body has not been found among them. It must have been consumed in the fire. At Surmaise, the roadmaker Brocard was placed among a number of hostages, just at the moment when he was being arrested with his son. His wife and daughter-in-law, in a state of panic, rushed to throw themselves into the Saule. The old man was able to free himself for a moment and ran in all haste after them and made several attempts to save them, but the Germans dragged him away pitilessly, leaving the 2 wretched women struggling in the river. When Brocard and his son were restored to liberty 4 days afterward and found the bodies, they discovered that both their wives had received bullet wounds to the head. At Tréaucourt, the Germans gave themselves up to the worst excesses. Angered doubtless by the remark which an officer had addressed to a soldier against whom a young girl of 19, Mille Hélène de Procès, had made complaint of on account of the indecent treatment to which she had been subjected, they burned the village and made a systematic massacre of the inhabitants. They began by setting fire to the house of an inoffensive householder, M. Jules Gand, and by shooting this unfortunate man as he was leaving his house to escape the flames. They then dispersed among the houses and the streets, firing off their rifles on every side. A young man, 17 years, Georges Lecourtier, who was tried to escape, was shot. M. Alfred Lallemand suffered the same fate. He was pursued into the kitchen of his fellow citizen Tautelier and murdered there while Tautelier received 3 bullets in his hand. Fearing, not without reason, for their lives, Mamelle Procès, her mother, and her grandmother of 71, and her old aunt of 81, tried to cross the trellis which separates their garden from a neighboring property with the help of a ladder. The young girl alone was able to reach the other side and to avoid death by hiding in the cabbages. As for the other women, they were struck down by rifle shots. It is a far cry from August 1914 to July 1928, but in those intervening years, the memory of what happened in Belgium during the German occupation has not been eradicated, as was evident at the dedication of the new Liberty at Louvain, July 4th, 1928, when the population was divided on the question of the inscription proposed to be placed on the building by Whitney Warren, American architect. Destroyed by German fury, restored by American generosity. Monsieur Ledoux, rector of the university, first tried to prevail upon Mr. Warren to select a milder inscription, and then, with the aid of the police, prevented the placing of the stones upon which the inscription had been carved. He had the support of thoughtful Germans who felt that no good could come from a perpetual reminder to the Germans of one of the most deplorable incidents of the war. But there were others, and among them the students of Louvain, who upheld the stand of the American architect and declared, "If an inscriptionless balustrade goes up, we might as well take down our war monuments." Mr. Warren explained that the inscription was approved by the late Cardinal Mercier, and he felt bound to stand by it. The fund for rebuilding the Louvain Library was raised by the public subscription from public schools, colleges, churches, and individuals in the United States. The building was under construction for some 3 years. A year before the rededication, the authorities of the university inquired if the donors insisted upon the inscription proposed by Mr. Warren, and suggested other inscriptions which would not be so objectionable to those who believed that the war was over. The university authorities were informed that the library was the outright gift of the American people, and that it was the right of the university authorities alone to determine what the inscription was to be.